you're riding your bike and moving right now, you're gonna be like super duper. But that'll be okay. But you didn't obviously talk about needing your rain jacket, did you? If you need your rain jacket, you just let it go quick. Is this grass or is this heat? Where are they gonna eat? Because it's heat.
Does that smell like?
Hanging up in the laundry room.
Prepare for the takeover of the robots.
Hello, folks. Are you making fun of me like some esoteric joke? Are you all my clothes? It's not a creature, go and exercise my teeth. Even if I don't scream. find the best way for my whole setup.
It's time to head out the door.
Hello, folks. Today we are doing some interesting things. We are, good morning. Good morning, YouTube. That person's name I thought said Armageddon, and I was like, okay, we're starting off first thing in the morning, but it doesn't. Anyway, today we are going to read a little bit more of Guinevere Turner's book that we're doing in Cult Book Club this month. The good news is I'm going to try to figure out a Patreon version of the book club because a lot of people want to join the book club, but the book club has been closed. So now I got to figure out how to make like levels and tiers and all of that stuff. We are going to probably record the next little bit of Uncultured. We are going to read a little bit from Rage Becomes Her by Soraya Shamali, and we are going to Soraya Shamali's book event tonight for, oh, it's over there. I can't reach it. The Resilience Myth is her new book. I'll bring it over here when we talk about it. And then I don't actually know if we're going to have time to get to Amish and Mennonite books today because I'm also going to be making a video recorded book out of this book. Now that I've invented it, I'm going to do it for other authors' books who don't have audiobooks. Man, I can't see the... Oh, here on Alanarchy. That's what it says. Oh, no, over here it says Armageddon. Oh, yeah, it's supposed to look like Armageddon. So this book is about, it's really like a single person cult, like a 1-1 cult, but it's through yoga. The worldview he gives her is through yoga. And we are doing this, goodness, I think next month for my book club. So I need to try to get the whole thing recorded. And this is my thing with authors. I'm like, experienced audiobook narrator, and people like to watch me knit. You don't have an audiobook. So through no extra work of your own, my husband and I will create a memoir read aloud video book, and then you'll get 50% of the profits. I think it's a pretty good deal for authors. Okay. Doing the bad thing I always do. Drinking coffee before reading out loud. I need like a table with like levels so I can set up all my screens. I just realized I need to start doing subscriptions and lives on Instagram too, which is my least favorite platform. Oh, but check out the shirt. I kept saying this over and over again on podcasts, and then one of you on TikTok was like, you need to put that on a shirt. And so I did. And because I'm very, very clever, on the back of this shirt, QR code for disrespectful t-shirts and QR code for signed version of Uncultured. Okay. We are going to start with Guinevere Turner's book. I am going to be knitting with 4 needles while also reading. It's going to trip you all out. It's also going to make a little bit of noise. So I'll probably need to switch to the quiet one when I make the audiobook. Not audio, video. It's not as good of quality as an audiobook because I don't stop for every mistake. Okay. So Guinevere Turner's book is fully focused on her experience in this kind of cult that is built around this single person called the Lyman family. It's a really good example of how cults do not have to be religious. And I'm going to go into this soliloquy because I think I've just figured out the best way to explain this question that anyone who talks about cults get asked, which is, what's the difference between cults and religion? And the difference is apples and oranges. Like, you're not even comparing the same things. But the stereotype that cults are religious, I think, is one of the most dangerous things. And I think, for example, that's why Nexium got so far. I mean, every day I have some ignorant, usually man, splain to me how cults have to be religious. And like, no, they don't. Even the religious cults are not, it's not a religion. It is a worldview that they are giving you that you must adopt. And there is one sacred assumption on which the whole house of cards rests. So honestly, okay, are many religious organizations cults? 100%. Many churches in America are as much of cults as the Children of God was. The Children of God is just like the ultimate goal for some of the evangelicals. I really, truly believe. And a whole part of my job is being like, yeah, you're doing the same thing as the bad guys. Religions are, I'm an atheist, obviously, right? And I'm not a religious scholar, but religions, in my opinions, are stories that societies make up so that we can get along together and so that we can explain sciencey things we don't understand yet. But religions are stories societies tell themselves with good intentions. Cults have much more in common with a con. In fact, cults are very big cons than they do with a religion. Now, you can make the argument that religion is a con, and I get you and I see you personally, but it's a very different thing from a cult. And I really, the more and more I study about cults, the more I firmly believe that it never happens by accident. The number one way you build a good group that's not a cult is you don't be a cult leader. Cults are always built by cult leaders. And I find it to be very significant that the cult leader does not, in fact, drink their own Kool-Aid. Jim Jones died from a bullet to the head. They do sometimes get trapped in their own things, and they do often have to precipitate their own apocalypse. But I describe this as they do it for the same reason that women fake orgasms sometimes, which is when you're building and building and building and building, you have to have a climax, whether it's real or not. Otherwise, people are going to get a little upset and stop coming back. So, yeah. And David Koresh is one of my primary examples for this. People are like, oh, government overreach, blah, blah, blah. Yes, the government sucks. However, the man who thought he was Jesus and was raping children, when he knew the assault was coming, gazed off into the distance and said, so it begins, or it cometh. I don't remember the exact Messiah-y thing that he said, but he was going to die that day. or that in that event, regardless of what the government did, is my firm belief. Okay. Now that I just ranted for a while, let me start reading. Okay, so Lyman family. The thing is, she leaves the cult when she's 11. She doesn't want to be out of the cult. She has to leave because her parents leave, so that's significant. And she doesn't talk about it too much, but it's a very interesting thing when people still idolize the cult. Obviously, writing as an adult, you can tell that she gets it now, but at the time, she idolized it. But what I think is fascinating about her story is she goes from actual cult to living with her stepfather and her enabler mother, her narcissistic stepfather and her enabler mother, and it's worse for her than it was in the actual cult. And I think a lot of times as cult babies, and we're trying to understand our parents and the way they raised us in an exact mix of too much control and also absolute neglect. A lot of times it's easy to put it on the cult, right? Like, oh, a cult did this. And I do think that about 80% of joiners are probably just the good seekers that want the world to be better. I think there's a good percentage, and these numbers are totally made up on the basis of I know stuff. I think about 20% of people that join cults are failed narcissists. And these are the Tom Cruises of Scientology, the Jeremy Spencers, formerly of Fleetwood Mac, from the Children of God. These are the people that don't want or don't have their own charisma. Jeremy Spencer would bite his toenails in public. But he could just bank on the charisma of the cult. It's called charisma by proxy. This is also true, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, when you try to use your little loophole of don't have a single leader, can't call us a cult. It is called charisma by proxy. Yes, hi on YouTube. You know, we're trying to build YouTube now. I realized it was pretty dangerous and silly of me to have all of my platformy stuff on just one site like TikTok. Oh boy, I've done it wrong. Okay. I think we're not going to knit with 4 needles today. We are just going to remake somebody's baby blanket for them. Ooh. Okay. So she's left them at 15, which I feel like is an age that a lot of people just break from their cult experience. We're old enough to know, like, it doesn't have to be this way. And she's moved out of the home of her horrible stepfather and her mother, back in with her grandmother. But now her mother's having another baby with the horrible abuser, and they are bringing her, using that to bring her back into the house. This is When the World Didn't End by Guinevere Turner. She was an actress and a writer on The L Word. And I'm going to meet her next Wednesday. Oh, I've already met her. I'm going to have her talk to my class, my cult book club. Okay. It was a terribly muggy, oppressive Saturday. Sorry. To introduce what I'm reading. Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading from When the World Didn't End by Guinevere Turner. She is out of the cult that she grew up in, but pretty much from the frying pan into the fire with her home situation. It was a terribly muggy, oppressive Saturday afternoon in August, and everyone was home, but in different corners of the house. Mom was lying on the couch in the living room, 9 months pregnant and incapacitated by the heat. Anna Lee was in her room. Well, it was my mother's room too now. Since I'd been away living at Granny's, she'd moved in with Anna Lee, something that was not explained to me. They'd set up a crib next to her bed in anticipation of the new baby. I now shared my very small bedroom with my brother, Benjamin, who was 16 months old. He was a sweet baby. I'd missed him, so I didn't mind at all. FP slept alone in the largest bedroom in the house. I wasn't allowed to see my friends or talk on the phone, although, of course, I talked on the phone all the time when FP wasn't home. This afternoon, FP was in his bedroom with Benjamin, and I could faintly hear him lecturing the baby about something, as if he was talking to a teenager. He was so obsessed with having this boy, and it was painful to witness his intensity and how Benjamin was already trying so hard to please him. I had just hauled the vacuum cleaner into the dining room, robotically unwinding its cord as I counted down the days to my freedom. The baby was due in 2 weeks. That left only a week or so before school started, and I was going to have to figure out a way to get back to Granny's before then. I knew Granny was wise to FP now and would be happy to help me. I hoped. We hadn't ever talked about him openly, but the way she acted when he came to visit said it all. I heard Benjamin whimper and then genuinely start to cry, and FP barked out, "You stop that whining right now." And then everything was quiet again, and I kicked the vacuum cleaner's on button as hard as I could, grateful for the sound of it to fill the void. All housekeeping that involved any physical exertion had become my job, and I'd dusted and vacuumed every room but this one. I hated this fucking room. I hated this fucking house. I hated vacuuming. I was seething about it all. Fucking psycho, I said, since I knew no one could hear me over the din of the vacuum cleaner. Still, I said it under my breath. It was damn hot, and when I turned off the vacuum a few minutes later to take a breath and pointlessly fan my face with my hand, I thought I heard a faint voice, but wasn't sure. A lawnmower was buzzing in the distance. Then it came again. My mom, in a thin and desperate tone that I barely recognized. "Can someone come in here, you guys?" I was the closest and raced into the other room, where I found her lying on the camel-colored couch in a pool of blood that was as big as her body and growing bigger by the second. Just 2 days before, I'd found my mother sitting on the couch, hands resting protectively on her enormous pregnant stomach, staring anxiously out the window, the open copy of Sophie's Choice she'd been reading abandoned next to her. We'd seen the film the year before, Meryl Streep starred in a gut-wrenching tale of a woman forced to choose which of her 2 children's lives would be spared during the Holocaust. My mother had been deeply moved by this film, as had I, and now she was reading the book. As if, I thought, the answers to her own problems might be inside the story. Before I'd spent 10 months away at my grandmother's house, I might have scoffed at her obsession with Sophie's Choice. She had, after all, effectively chosen between her children. She left the communities assuming she'd get Anna Lee and never see me again. And then she got saddled with me anyway, and we all knew how that was going. But in my time, I'd gained a tiny sliver of perspective, and the seeds of seeing her as another trapped human, rather than a failed protector, had been planted. When I would start to feel this way, I ritualistically reminded myself of all the terrible things she'd said and done, to stave off even a sliver of empathy. But that day, something about how distraught she looked made me feel bad for her. When I sat down in a nearby chair and asked, genuinely meaning it, "What's wrong, Mom? You look upset." She gave one of her signature epic sighs and said nothing for a long time. "Mom, are you okay?" I finally asked, getting worried. "There's something wrong with this baby," she said, still looking out the window. "Something doesn't feel right." I stifled the urge to laugh. Something doesn't feel right, I thought. There isn't a single right thing about you having this baby. Why are you even having another baby with this man? Further tethering yourself to him and making sure we will all be prisoners forever. Who would bring another person into this house of horrors? And how the fuck am I back here again? But I'd learned this was the kind of outburst that would only make her cry and would change nothing. And so it was pointless. And right now, she seemed so freaked out that it just seemed mean. I fought the empathy again as it swelled up. Mean? Of course I was mean. She'd turned me into a mean person with the dog eat dog dynamic in this household, a never ending cycle of betrayal and violence. Lately, I'd noticed myself laughing like her sometimes, bitter, mirthless, and I hated that. I pretty much hated everything, living only for the distant, vague, but bright light of finally escaping when I went to college. Lost my place. What I said was, "Come on, Mom, you've done this 3 times before. It's going to be fine." Indeed, a favorite expression of hers over the years had been, "Oh, please, after 3 kids, it's like Grand Central Station down there." One more nail in the coffin of me ever having kids. But she sat up, one hand flailing in the air. "Exactly. I've done this 3 times, and so I know what it feels like when something is wrong." This time, her tone was chilling, and I didn't feel like laughing at her anymore. So now, 2 days later, when I found her lying in a giant pool of blood, I couldn't help seeing that she was right, that something was wrong with this baby, and it was terrifying. When I dashed in from the other room, she was weakly trying to prop herself up, blood running down her legs as she did. "FP," I called out, "help us." He was there in a flash and scooped her up in his arms, carrying her out of the room, blood dripping onto the carpet as he kicked the front door open. "Clean up that mess," he yelled over his shoulders, then hurried down the driveway to his truck, hoisting her into the passenger seat. Anna Lee had come out of her room, and as we heard the car peel out of the driveway, then looked at the bloody couch, we both burst into tears. From the other room, Benjamin started crying too. "You get him," I said to Anna Lee. "I am going to get some paper towels." She nodded bravely, trying to control the little gasping sobs coming out of her, and walked out of the room. In the living room, a few minutes later, with Benjamin playing safely secured by Anna Lee in his playpen in the dining room, we pressed the paper towels into the couch and watched as blood seeped up into our hands and engulfed our wrists. We didn't say anything, just cried and tried to soak up the blood. I was 16 and she was 9, but for a moment we were both just scared kids. A few hours later, the phone finally rang. I fled to the wall-mounted yellow phone in the kitchen and breathlessly grabbed it on the 3rd ring. Anna Lee followed close at my heels, standing beside me and looking up anxiously as I answered. It was FP, telling me that Mom was doing fine and that the baby was a girl, but they weren't sure if she was going to be okay because she'd gotten no oxygen to her brain from the time Mom started bleeding until they did an emergency C-section, which was about 20 minutes later. "But your mother is going to be in bed for about 3 weeks until she heals," FP said. "So we're definitely going to need you to stay around here." There was smugness in his voice, I thought, because he knew it would be hard for me to say no to this. Still, Mom was alive and the baby was alive, and it was a girl. I hung up the phone and said, "They're okay. It's going to be okay. We have a little sister, and they're naming her Julie. Julie Elizabeth." I instinctively hugged Anna Lee, then danced around with her a little, and she looked so surprised that I realized maybe I'd never hugged her before. And we'll stop there. Being happy that the baby's a girl in that household. It's yikesy. This book is hard to read. Somebody told me that this book was harder for them to read than Uncultured, and I was like, how? But yeah, it might be. Oh, hi, Snips. About working on a memoir. That's cool. I'm guessing with 20 minutes of no oxygen to the brain that the baby is not going to survive. Let's see. No, the chapter ends and says, that was September, and he did completely leave me alone. But in October, he kicked my mother out, and Mom, Annalie, Benjamin, and Julie all came to live at Granny's with me. So yeah, maybe she does survive. So my child, when the world didn't end, is what it's called. My child didn't breathe for 7 minutes after she was born, and it was the worst, craziest, scariest thing of my life. Okay, now we're going to read Uncultured. This chapter is about medical neglect. So for the person that said they want to write their life story, you're telling a story based on your life. So you're picking the parts of your life that you're taking to tell a story. Your book should be about one idea. So I read, and by the way, I have a whole folder on TikTok called Writing Your Story. You can check out the videos in there. I'm also making a series for my subscribers on TikTok or Patreon, which you can be a subscriber of, and then you get On American, my video book for free, all my premium content. Oh yeah, we're going to read one of those essays today too, if we get to everything. And so I listened to Educated, and I was like, boom, that's it, right? So there's two different kinds of cult books. There's this one that we read, which is a very good book, but I describe it as, and then she didn't die, right? Like she survived the cult, and she's giving you that story. I did not want to write that story. Then there is a book that is like about an actual idea, and the story is illustrating that idea. And for Educated, I call that idea that education is our best defense against extremism. Like that's the idea of this book. And so the idea of Uncultured is that human beings will do almost anything to fit into their voluntary groups. And that was a group behavior concept. And I was like, I can show you that in the microsystem of the cult, the macro system of the US Army. Another good tip I got was make every chapter in your book like it could be its own TED Talk. What I took that to mean was like every chapter is about something. It sounds like I'm telling you the chronological story of my life, but there's a reason I tell you about this accident and not any other scene of my life that happened when I was 6 years old. Right. So that's a good way to do it. The more themes you can get into your life story, the bigger your market is going to be. Right. So like I wrote a book about 20 different things because there's so many different themes running throughout this book. And in any of those themes, I can be like, oh, I wrote a book about that and bring it back to this. Now I've just released Un-American, which is about power, privilege, whiteness, otherness, and what it means to be un-American/un-American. So now I'm a somewhat expert on those topics too. I can be like, oh, I wrote a book on this. So like, I think the reason, or I will say for sure that the reason why I said I'm going to write a big book, and then I did write a big book and get it out there, which is not true for most people's memoirs, is because I realize that you have to be learning how to market your art at the same time as you're making good art. A lot of people just get too involved in the making of the good art, and then they have no idea how to sell it. Okay. Reading half of these chapters, and these are going in, obviously the live stream, but these are going in my premium content as well. Ultimately, we'll have a whole read aloud while knitting version of Uncultured. I'll switch to my quieter notes. Where did I put that project? I just saw a Duffel blog that the Army's holding a change of command ceremony on OnlyFans. It's hilarious. much less hilarious that they try to kick women out of the military for having OnlyFans accounts or doing something like the WAP dance. But it's totally cool and fine when special forces do a mock-up of the Miami Dolphins doing Call Me Maybe, half naked. Totally cool. Soldiers gotta F around while they're at war, you know? Come on, we can all understand it. But the two women that did the WAP video in uniform definitely got kicked out of the Air Force. Yeah. Is it hard for me to understand why someone who leaves a cult doesn't leave a religion? No. It's when you leave a cult, you lose your entire worldview. And a lot of people need to just adopt another worldview so that they know how to function. Usually we all do for a little while. We just don't all choose religion. I chose making straight A's with no education and working 4 jobs as my worldview. High control group. Anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. Petropolis, Brazil, 1993. There were times when my nervous tics would subside, when I was able to escape for a few brief moments. Chapter 4, Anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. Petropolis, Brazil, 1993. There were times when my nervous tics would subside, when I was able to escape for a few brief, beautiful moments, the near constant fear and confusion of my childhood. On Friday nights, we sometimes got to watch Systemite movies as part of a complicated reward and punishment structure to ensure our good behavior during the week. Though there was a strict ban on Systemite music and almost any kind of outside influences, the prophet liked movies, and so they were another thing to be controlled, doled out, their lessons distilled and pontificated on. We kept mostly to ancient classics like Charlton Heston's The 10 Commandments or Ben-Hur, musicals like The Sound of Music, Brigadoon, and My Fair Lady, or any movie that could be used to reinforce the idea that the outside world was evil, like Escape to Witch Mountain, which I found out was made by Mormons, or later on, most surprisingly, The Matrix, which was supposed to be an allegory for the Systemite world being slaves to delusion, while the children of God were the only ones free, but which we really just liked for the special effects and action scenes. My favorite was Sound of Music. On weekends, I imagined we were a real family, like the Von Trapps. Saturday nights were the best, parent night, when we got to leave the dorm and sleep on the floors of our parents' rooms, which would lead into Sundays, when we had permission to spend the day with them and our immediate siblings. Other than a few hours of devotions in the morning and a few more hours of studying the Bible during midday nap time, we had no agenda. We even got to skip the hours of Bible reading if we were out on adventures. Sometimes we went to state parks. Sometimes we even took trips to the beautiful Brazilian beaches, where I would spy on the other children, copying how they played in the surf and built sandcastles, imagining I could understand their words, that I was a normal child just like them. On family outings, we didn't have to stand in long lines, and Mom hardly ever yelled at us. She wasn't an auntie in those moments, telling the other adults if we did something wrong. With no one else watching, she was just Mom. We got to be her kids, not family kids. Even Uncle Zephaniah relaxed when it was only our family, away from everyone else, nobody judging his level of spiritual devotion based on the behavior of his stepchildren. My favorite days were picnic days. We had food just for us, and those were the few times from my childhood when I can remember feeling full. Often our picnic food was bread with butter and a slice of cheese, but sometimes we would have canned sardines or tuna. usually saved for pregnant or nursing women, to eat with our sandwiches. Because Mom was pregnant or nursing almost all the time, she had access to those precious cans. And on picnic days, outside of scores of watchful eyes, she could share with us too. When I was 6, on a gorgeous summer day, we went out for a picnic on the hills, overlooking the commune. Mom, Uncle Zephaniah, Mary, baby Timmy, just a few months old, and me. Hibiscus flowers as big as my head flourished in all colors, their petals wide open, decorating the landscape like a rainbow, the smell of gardenia sweetening the air. We climbed to the top of the largest hill and spread out a blanket under a wax apple tree, the special tropical fruit normal Americans never got to eat. Mom laid baby Timmy on the blanket, his peach skin standing out against the patchwork quilt we had crocheted a little each night from random scraps of yarn. Life was suddenly in color on the hills, the bold white of the frangipani flowers with their sunset insides against dark green foliage, and bougainvillea flowers in every color from pale yellow to the deepest violet, the different shades of blue from the blanket, the red apple clusters above, the bright green grass all around. The bread was only a little stale, surely donated by one of our contacts in town once it was unsellable. But the tangy, salty sardines covered up most of the bad taste, and we got butter, too. I climbed the tree and threw wax apples down to Mary, who gathered them in a small pile on the corner of the blanket. And then we ate and ate until we felt satisfied. Alongside the safety of the trees, away from the uncles and aunties, we played tag and screamed at the tops of our lungs. It was exhilarating to hear my own voice so loud, unrestrained by the big open sky. Uncle Zephaniah played the guitar, and we all sang along. The baby fell asleep, and for a while, everything felt perfect, like we really were the Von Trapps. These moments of happiness were always shadowed by the knowledge that they would soon end, and I would have to go back to my group after dinner, to that dorm room, to a whole new week of waiting to spend time with my real family again, a week of getting punished at night because I cried for my mommy. As it always did, time slipped away and we had to return. Mom carried the baby and held Mary's hand, while I helped Uncle Zephaniah stack the dishes and picnic things into his arms. I followed him as he started to navigate his way. The hill looked much steeper than I remembered from our climb up. My feet slipped back and forth in my donated rubber flip-flops, always a bit too big. I had to catch myself several times to keep from tripping. Halfway down, I spotted a large metal sheet lying on the grass. Uncle Zephaniah explained it was a water tank sunk into the ground, and it was the source of our commune's water. I walked over to investigate. "Daniella," Mom called, and I turned quickly. I don't remember losing my balance, only how beautiful everything looked. The hill and the sky and the grass, all suddenly turned upside down. I put my hands out to catch myself and felt the cold, rusty metal as my hand struck the ground, my body following behind it. I leapt up, brushed the dirt off my scraped knees. Why was Uncle Zephaniah running toward me? Why did he have that look on his face? Why was he throwing the dishes from his arms? An empty sardine can tumbled down the hill, and I wondered why he would litter as I pictured the posters hanging on the walls of our dorms with quotes like, "Cleanliness is godliness." Grandpa would be so mad, I thought. My palm burned slightly where it had touched the edge of the water tank. I looked down and, for a moment, could not connect what I saw with my own body. Blood was pouring onto the bright green grass, drenching the pink flip-flops on my feet, and gushing around bone that stayed, somehow, miraculously white. My hand looked like it had been carved open, the wound pulling apart like the letter O that was so easy to write in cursive. I screamed, and nobody stopped me, nobody shushed me, nobody slapped me. My mouth opened and everything came out, a sound from the very depths of me, a sound I didn't even know I had. I didn't care what happened to my hand. I wanted to keep screaming. I don't remember how we got down the steep hill, but I learned later Uncle Zephaniah carried me. By the time we got to the big house, I was delirious from pain, my head fuzzy from the loss of blood, and my yelling. The grown-ups poured cold water and alcohol over my hand. It felt like fire, shoved directly inside my palm. They called one of Uncle Zephaniah's musician friends, Uncle Micah, because he had had medical training as a dental assistant during the Systemite War between America and Vietnam. Uncle Micah pushed the skin and prodded it together, winding meters of gauze around my hand and a small wooden plank as a splint. Nobody dared suggest we ask for help. Nobody used the words doctor or hospital. We did what we always did when someone got hurt or fell sick. We cleaned and disinfected the injury. We called whoever passed as an expert from the commune to help out. And then we prayed and prayed and prayed. If we prayed hard enough, asked God to forgive our sins, and truly believed, then eventually we would be healed. I knew that Uncle Zephaniah and Mom would be required to pray too, would have to share with the leadership why they thought God had punished their child. They'd have to write about it in their open heart reports for the home shepherds to review. What lesson was God trying to teach them by hurting me? After my hand was bandaged, I rested on my bunk, alone, my whole arm throbbing under the layers of bloodied gauze. I tried not to move, not to make any sound as I cried. I begged God to forgive me, to forgive my parents. God knew my thoughts, knew how bad I was. He knew I had fantasized too much about life outside the compound. He knew I had been too happy on Parent Day, had been enjoying the fruits of this world and not the fruits of the Spirit, and not thinking about him at all. So he punished me. He made me bleed and ended Parent Day, and it was all my fault. The adults said napping would help the wound close, but sleep felt impossible with the nausea and throbbing fire in my hand. Somehow, I eventually managed to drift off, but pain jolted me wide awake. It was almost night, but still light enough that I could see the entire bandage had turned light red. My sheets were sticky with blood. I wanted to pull the gauze off and see how much Jesus had healed my hand, but I knew I'd get in trouble for it. So I got out of bed, thinking of Humpty Dumpty and wondering how long it took Jesus to put him back together again. I could hear dishes clinking when I approached the big dining room, the sound of hundreds of people eating together. I found my parents, and seeing my bloody hand, they called Uncle Micah and also Uncle Pethuel to examine me. When they opened the bandage, a smell like something rotten filled my nose. The wound's edges were bright red, looking angry, and were filled with yellow pus. They argued about what to do with me. Someone said time is of the essence. Someone said hospital. The forbidden word, the evil place. That's where they were taking me. As they packed me into the car, I wondered if I was such a bad sinner that Jesus didn't want to heal me. I sat up front between the driver and passenger seat, motion sick the way I always was in a vehicle, as we drove through the mountains high above the sprawling city of Rio de Janeiro, along Petropolis's cobblestone roads to the nearest public hospital. Uncle Zephaniah held my hand in his lap, his fingers clenched against the makeshift splint. Mom stayed behind with Mary and the baby. Nobody reprimanded me, even though I couldn't stop crying. They were taking me to a Systemite doctor who would examine me and hurt me, like he did Gabriella and the kids from the raid. I knew Mom and Uncle Zephaniah would get into trouble, and I knew I was responsible. When we got there, we were seen right away. As soon as the doctor unwrapped my hand, she started yelling in Portuguese. I couldn't understand her, but I caught snippets of what Uncle Pethuel translated to Uncle Zephaniah. She was mad at them, blaming me for not bringing them in sooner. They argued with her over how many hours had passed since I fell. The doctor yelled strange new words. Negligencia, anesthesia. And Uncle Zephaniah yelled back, no, no. I lay on the hospital bed, being yelled over, like I wasn't even there. Nurses prodded me, and even though it was different from the auntie's slaps, it still felt like I was being punished. I was already dizzy, so it was easy to do my trick of going away, of floating above myself and watching. I couldn't feel anything as I stared at the metal instruments. All the devices I knew were designed for torture. Auntie Dora had been right. She told the truth about the hospital. Finally, Uncle Zephaniah explained they needed to give me something called shots. Then I would need to stay still while the doctor sewed my hand back together. He said it would hurt. It was so cold in that room. There was fear in Uncle Zephaniah's eyes. I imagined myself as our blanket of granny squares, crocheted out of tiny scraps of waste yarn, being stitched together piece by piece. I tried to stay floating, but I couldn't. The liquid from the tetanus shot burned as it ran through my veins, the devil's work thrusting through my body. I would be forever tainted, impure. I tried not to punishment. The nurses moved me to a big table covered with a paper sheet. The doctor hid her face behind a white mask as she stretched my hand away from my body, her fingers clasped around her sharp sewing needle. The whole scene looked exactly like a music video we'd filmed, where the Antichrist soldiers held down a true believer while an evil doctor implanted the mark of the beast in her right hand. I sucked my breath and told myself this was different. Since it was my left hand, I'd be okay. Still got the big scar right there. For all the people that like to say my story's made up. 6 people pinned me to the hospital table. The doctor pushed the needle through my skin with no more effort than stitching cloth. I screamed as the pain shot through my body, as the systemite doctor with her horrible needle sliced black thread directly through me, in and out, over and over. I was trapped. I was being tortured, just like Auntie Dora said. I screamed like hell and fought with all the strength I had in my skinny arms and legs, like we'd been taught in the comics. But my powers from Jesus didn't come through. Uncle Zephaniah covered my mouth with his big hand, the freckles and red hair on his arms oversized and up close. But I kept screaming, kept writhing and kicking, even as Uncle Pethuel held my other arm, even as the masked systemite nurses held down my feet. I tried to bite Uncle Zephaniah's hands, and he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and I thought maybe something hurt him too. It seemed like it took hours for the stitching to end, but pain and memory are terrible companions. On the drive home, Uncle Zephaniah hugged me tightly and told me how much he'd wanted to punch the lady doctor in her face. He told me he was so sorry that he hadn't left the dishes on the hill and held my hand instead. But he also declined the painkillers and evil drugs we'd been offered because we had the power of prayer. I didn't understand why he was apologizing. Adults didn't apologize to kids. But he said he had received a check from the Holy Spirit to hold my hand when we were walking down the hill and had ignored it. Despite my pain, a nice warmth came over me. Maybe it wasn't my fault after all. Maybe Jesus wasn't punishing me. Sometimes God punished children for their parents' sins as a way to teach them a lesson by watching their kids suffer. That meant Uncle Zephaniah was my real dad, not just an uncle. I fell asleep in the car with my head on his shoulder, comforted by this thought, thinking maybe all that pain had been worth something. Now I have a daughter that also says that anesthesia doesn't work on her. And we're both neurodiverse, and I wonder if maybe I did get anesthesia and still felt all of it. Medical neglect. I have thought about medical neglect a lot because anytime that the cult did something and the army also did something, And it either ties to programming and influence and power and control. And with medical care specifically, I think that it just is automatic in a total institution. Because in any type of total institution, a total institution is where you live and work with like-situated people removed from the world with a formal round of life. Any kind of total institution, your job is not to stand out. Your job is never to put yourself, the individual, above the group. In the Army, we even have a cadence for this. It's called the Army song, and we sing it at every event. And it goes, and the Army goes rolling along. Anyone's son will do. And so I think that the medical neglect comes about almost automatically in those environments because medical care, by definition, mental or physical health care, is you raising your hand and being like, I, the individual, need something. In the Army specifically, the only time we let you go to the doctor is to skip the early morning unit workout and go to the doctor. And then we call you sick call rangers and make fun of you, even at the very high leadership level. Also stands out to me that a lot of cult survivors have their breakthrough, their crack in the brainwashing, with a medical emergency, usually of themselves or their child. Something like that happens with my mom, and it's how she leaves the cult eventually. And so I spent a lot of time about that too, thinking about that. And I was watching The Vow about Nexium, and this one actress, like, they were supposed to be putting on this play, and they started 15 minutes late. And so the next day, Keith Raniere says to her, like, what happened? Why did the show start late? And she was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, I had to get something to eat. I had just been working so hard. Cults are always about labor. And he just looks at her and he just goes, sometimes you just have to pass out. And that's when she knew. And I think, like, the reason we have these breakthroughs with medical emergencies is because we actually realize there is no limit to what the organization will ask us to sacrifice for them, and they'll never do it for us. The other story I always have to tell when I talk about this is how sometime in 2012, but before the CIA, the scandal, the cheating scandal of General Petraeus, who, by the way, probably kicked many, many, many human beings out of the military for adultery. So before that, he comes to the 101st, where he used to be the commander of, and he throws himself a parade. Who else do we know that threw themselves a military parade? If you're thinking the felon who used to be in the White House, you are correct. So General Petraeus, who's an absolute asshole, and everybody who knows him hates his guts, and nobody from the 101st was surprised about the scandal. So he comes, throws himself a parade, which the logistics of this, by the way, is that a division's worth of soldiers. Babe, how much is a division? Like 20,000?
Sure.
Probably 20,000 soldiers on Fort Campbell, potentially more. So 20,000 soldiers, let's say, are going to be out there practicing for 8 hours the day before, and then marching and standing at the position of attention for 8 hours the day of. Giving a soldier ibuprofen and saying, drink water and walk it off, yes, is medical neglect. And I have a story about that too. Okay, so General Petraeus gives this order that if anyone passes out, because when you're standing at the position of attention, the easiest way to keep yourself there and keep yourself still is by locking your knees. And that, for some reason, makes blood not go to your brain and it makes you pass out. So he gave and of course, senior leaders think soldiers do this on purpose. So he gave the order that anyone that passes out will not be taken to the rear of the formation. They will lie where they fell. And after we stand here for a few hours and listen to him give himself a verbal blowjob, we are going to march. We are going to march a division. So obviously in 2012, we were not going to trample soldiers to death because cameras. But 100 years ago, that would have been a death order. That is him saying anybody that can't keep themselves from passing out deserves to die. That's General Petraeus for you. Now you will see why he is one of the cult leader examples in my books. So medical neglect with ibuprofen, right? So in the military, at least in the Army, we call Motrin vitamin M. And anytime you have any sort of injury, they're going to give you an 800 milligram, 800 Motrin, and tell you to drink water and walk it off. And so there was this soldier that I met at Walter Reed when I was medically evacuated from Afghanistan for health reasons, for a brain tumor that I was told I was making it all about me. I met this soldier who was a private, who was telling his leadership that he was having hip pain every day. And he was told, take a Motrin, drink water, go back on patrol. Until one day, his hip broke in half on patrol, and they realized he had quite advanced bone marrow cancer. That soldier then got written up by a non-commissioned officer for missing the accountability formation at Walter Reed, where they make you show up so they can say, yes, you're still alive, because he was at chemo. And anyways, he's dead now. That's what I mean by medical neglect in the military, just like the cult. The second part of that chapter that we will read tomorrow is all about all the people that died because of the medical neglect. Okay. Rage becomes her. Damn it, I should have made a video of that medical neglect story. That was silly of me. Okay. Today for Devotions with Daniella. I always start too fast. Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading from Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger by Soraya Shamali. This is a chapter called Angry Bodies. A whole spectrum of health issues is now clearly linked to how people feel and express anger, which directly affects our hormonal system, immunity against disease, heart function, muscles, and skeleton. The headache that I experienced is the result of what is called somatization, in which a mental state, such as anxiety or anger, expresses itself physically, despite there being no evidence of a known medical condition. It is particularly common in women who ignore, divert, or otherwise minimize their anger. Over time, those mismanagements are almost always unhealthy, and they frequently become physically painful. So does deconstruction. Anger releases specific stress hormones, such as adrenaline and cortisol, in the body that have a direct impact on health. Both of these hormones provide important clarity and energy that is useful in short-term, stressful, or threatening situations. However, long-term elevated adrenaline and cortisol are distinctly unhealthy. Cortisol results in increased blood sugars, glucose, affects the immune system, alters digestion, and influences growth and the reproductive system. Mood, behavior, motivation, and desire are all affected. Our bodies and brains process what we think of as irritations and daily hassles in the same way they process threat. Women who repress their anger are twice as likely to die from heart-related disease. Responding with extreme rage, however, is similarly problematic. 2 hours after a vitriolic outburst, the risk of a heart attack increases 5-fold, and the chance of suffering a stroke 4-fold. People with chronically elevated blood pressure or hypertension have a notable inability to express anger confidently and effectively. Likewise, strong, unprocessed negative emotions negatively affect our immune system. Studies have shown that even remembering an angry experience results in a decline in antibodies. the first line of defense in fending off disease. One study concluded that within 3 to 4 days of an anger incident, people are more likely to develop the common cold. Repressed anger is now considered a risk factor for a panoply of other ailments. Women are 3 times more likely to develop disabling and painful autoimmune illnesses, those in which the body, in essence, attacks itself by producing self-damaging antibodies, than men are. For example, women suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome at 4 times the rate men do, and they are twice as likely to develop the neurodegenerative disease, multiple sclerosis. They also make up more than 90% of people suffering from fibromyalgia, which causes deep and sleep and mood disruptions and widespread musculoskeletal pain. Certain cancers, particularly breast cancer, and particularly in Black women, I wondered if we were going to get there, have been linked to what researchers describe as extreme suppression of anger. In Black women, who suffer some of the highest rates of breast cancer, the illness has been correlated with perceived experiences of discrimination and the anger they cause. A 12-year longitudinal study, which assesses change over time, found a 70% increase in cancer-related deaths in people with the highest scores for suppressing their negative emotions. A follow-up to a landmark 1989 study on this topic found that the survival rate for women with breast cancer who expressed their anger was twice as that of women who kept their anger to themselves. It's important to be clear that anger does not cause these illnesses, but studies repeatedly suggest, and in some cases confirm, that its mismanagement is implicated in their incidence and prevalence among women. Emotional distress is linked to multiple behaviors that together create a complex matrix of cause and effect that, for example, predispose a woman to have a heart attack or develop breast cancer. Improved survival seen in studies about women who expressed anger does not prove that saying, "I am angry," affects a cure, but rather that the ability to think and talk about emotions, and in the case of anger in particular, feel control over factors in one's life, might lead to deeper understanding, more aggressive approaches to treatment, and overall healthier decisions. Women who are more expressive are also more assertive, and therefore more likely to reach their treatment options and to follow their physician's recommendations, and so on. The complicated nature of the problem is evident in the degree to which experiences of anger and stress, like other health issues, are racialized and classed. Economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton of Princeton University captured a lot of attention in 2015 when they described dramatically rising rates of mortality amongst middle-aged non-Hispanic students. Amongst middle-aged non-Hispanic whites. They described the primary cause, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, as deaths of despair. People with incomes below the poverty line are 2 times more likely to be living with chronic pain and 3 to 5 times more likely to express regular extreme pain and mental distress. People with so-called anger issues are also at higher risk for substance abuse. Suicide, like substance abuse, is closely tied to shame. Suicide is, according to Dr. Michael Lewis, an expert in emotional and intellectual development, likely to be the result of shame associated with rage directed inwards. This news was treated as explosive when the research was released. But for years, researchers and members of the medical profession have argued for a greater understanding of how identity, class, gender, ethnicity profoundly impacts health. Harvard public health sociologist David R. Williams has created a scale that measures how systemic discrimination generates health inequalities. When it comes to the intersections of gender, class, and ethnicity, women of color are living with significantly degraded health and care. So much of this is true, by the way, for cult survivors. And make a video. So we were just reading from Rage Becomes Her by Soraya Shamali. Check out the video before this. And she's talking about how unexpressed anger or mismanaged anger can result in a lot of physical symptoms. And surprise, surprise, this tends to hit women more. And surprise, surprise, this definitely affects Black women the most. But as I'm reading it, I'm like, this is also very true of what cult survivors go through. And I keep trying to tell the people that are mad at me for speaking out that, like, there is no accepted scientific version of just tuck it all away and you'll be fine. That's not a thing. It comes out eventually. Most of us from Children of God are able to run hard till about 40 or 50 before we have our huge breakdowns. But we start getting all the autoimmune things in our 20s and 30s. I went into the military and doubled down on all of my trauma, another thing that most of my cult survivor fellows don't realize. And I wrote about it in this best-selling book, Uncultured. And so I broke at 27. And I had, spoiler alert, don't keep watching this if you're planning to read Uncultured and you haven't, I was medically evacuated from Afghanistan for a brain tumor that I did not have. I had a pseudo brain tumor, as far as we can tell. And it can cause all of the same effects. And it's definitely was like just the beginning of my breakdown. But I get asked this question a lot from people. They were like, what happened? I was fine. And now I'm like so much worse. Trust me when I say I get it. I won a marathon while deployed in April. Just Google my name and Boston Shadow Marathon and you'll see the women's running article. And 2.5 months later, I was being carried out of there on a litter. I'd lost 30 pounds. I had so many things wrong with me. And there just like wasn't a simple cause. And so kind of the way I describe it is like, you have this crack in the brainwashing, right? And that's when everything starts. But you have about a decade. So my deconstruction model is first you have to have the crack in the brainwashing, physically and mentally leave. That's stage one. Then you have a decade, which starts when you start it, of understanding why you were in a cult and what impacts it has on your personality and identity. And if you were born in a cult like me, especially generations in, this is going to drive you to study your parents, systems, groups, sociology, all of this stuff. And I think of this decade as like a bell curve or a hill, right? Like at some point you're fine and you can totally handle it. And then at some point, like everything has just come rushing in. The dam has come down and everything is just flowing. And you usually have quite a few significant health issues. And I tell people when they're going through this, like, look, go to the doctor. But if the doctor can't figure it out, yes, come back here and talk to the deconstruction community. Thank you so much for reading my story. It was the part of the book you felt seen in, started to break at 36. Yeah. All of it. I mean, I just had a mini version of this like 2 weeks ago. I'm still recording, so okay. 2 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I had to read this book called Jesus Land, which is about the Troubled Teen Institute. And the first time I read it, I was waking up to my story. Like there's the saying that nobody reads your story, they read their story. The second time I read it, I was just so floored by the amount of trauma. But we're reading it at my book club and I read the book club. So I had to push through. And I seriously told myself, I was like, okay, I wonder what's going to happen. Like, I wonder what's this going to look like. And no kidding, 5 days later, I am on my couch like this with something called Rhine neck, which was so painful that I thought it was a pinched nerve. And I was like, there you go. That's why people ask me how I can do this every day, all the time. And I'm like, trust and believe when I say that my stuff goes off between 3 and 4 p.m. and I spend the rest of the day not talking about cults, hanging out with my family, making clothes, doing art. And that's how I survive it. Right now, I've been busier than possible. Somebody found my channel when they searched for military sexual trauma. I am very glad to hear that. I have written this book, Uncultured, about growing up in the world's worst sex cult as a child, and then going into, I'm sorry, the world's worst sex cult might be the US Army. Yeah, check that out. Okay. Now I'm going to read you an essay I wrote about Minesweeper and white privilege. I should really stop recording. All right, I'm going to blow y'all's mind. I promise you, half of you have never heard this before. At least half, probably a lot more. Sorry, I just got to find my blog. If you Google Medium and my name, I do have a blog. And when I was on Twitter prior to selling the book, I used to every Sunday just do something called Coffee and Culture. And I would just sit there and write an hour-long thread on a topic. And then later I would just like shift it into an essay and post it. So I have quite a few, and I'm going to start putting them as premium content on my stuff. This one is called Minesweeper Tricks and White Privilege. Oh my. Okay. I can't see YouTube right while I'm reading this because I have to have the essay up. There's an important link. I don't know how I'm going to share that link. I don't think I'm going to be able to. So people are just going to have to Google it, or I'll post the link with the video. I think there's an audio lag on TikTok or on YouTube or on Patreon. There's definitely a lag as it rebroadcasts to Patreon. Okay. This is an essay that I wrote a little while ago, thinking about my own journey with deprogramming the myth of white supremacy out of my life. This essay is called Minesweeper Tricks and White Privilege. Oh my, just wanted to remind you all of what Minesweeper looks like. Today, we are talking about privilege, but also the game Minesweeper. How are those things related, you ask? Let's discuss. Please see this link for the trick of how to play Minesweeper. The link will be found wherever you're watching this video. Okay, so if you didn't watch the video, suffice it to say, there's a trick to Minesweeper that most people do not seem to know. I know this because I figured it out while isolated in a religious cult. Yes, I had access to a computer so I could learn to be a secretary. The trick is that if you click both mouse buttons on any square, it will show you which squares can be bombs. If you do that on a square where all possible bombs have already been marked, then it will automatically expand more squares. If you don't get it, video. Trust and believe, I have done an expert Minesweeper in 99 seconds. Ever since I moved to the United States at 15, whenever Minesweeper comes up, as it does, I've told people about the trick. That's when a funny thing happens. People start to get really, really defensive. Basically, a certain group of people will angrily try to argue that it doesn't exist. They stick to their certainty regardless of argument, and then throw their hands up in despair when I demonstrate beyond all doubt that it does, in fact, exist. These people believe that because they all played Minesweeper as children, to their increasing frustration of never winning or spending hours trying to math it out, but didn't know there even was a trick, then it cannot possibly be true. They cling to this with fervor. I've recently noticed how many similarities this has to the way some people react to the concept of privilege. So now that I've got you all fondly thinking of your childhood game, let's talk about that. What is privilege? There are obviously thousands of definitions, but let's try. My favorite definition of privilege is the ability to not have to notice something. Privilege is essentially any advantage that you have over another person, or usually a group of people, that you were born into, i.e., did not work for. Being American, big one of those. We talk about things like white, male, able-bodied, intelligence, looks, etc., being types of privilege. Nobody deserves these. Now, when we start talking about the organizations and systems that we all live in, work in, and operate under, privilege starts to become systemic and institutionalized. And that's where it can really start to do some damage. That's also where it can start to go unquestioned. The first time I heard the term white privilege, it was because a white friend of mine was angrily arguing that it didn't exist. Without any further information, I knew that it did because of the very argument he was using. I worked for everything I have. I began looking. I knew that by most people's definition, I'd worked for everything I had, much more than that friend, too. I escaped a cult at 15, moved to the US pretty much alone, had exactly $0, and was told I couldn't even be enrolled in high school because I didn't exist. For more on that story, check out Uncultured, autographed copies available here. I put myself through high school and college, became an Army officer, and have had many other successes and accomplishments that I'm very proud of. Still, I knew that day that my advantages had a name, white privilege. I knew that if I'd been as Latina as I feel, I would have struggled more. Coming to the US from Brazil, one of the more diverse countries, I have many friends that I think of as just like me, but there are significant differences. They are brown and black. I also knew that racism in the US is a whole beast that I had never seen quite so bad in other places. When I accepted white privilege, that was an awakening for me. I could still be proud of my accomplishments, but I had to look at the entire game through a new light. I had to begin to see all of the other privileges that I have. Where many want to deny it, I wanted to understand it. I can look at it and list them out. I'm white, attractive, according to white supremacy, smarter than average, and able-bodied in ways others never have been, even though I'm 100% disabled. None of these are things that I can have possibly worked for, and all of these are things that have advantaged me. I was also a girl/woman from a very underprivileged background. That was my intersectionality. These are areas where I had disadvantages, regardless of my privilege in other areas. That's okay to acknowledge too. Naturally, like I do with any new idea, I got excited, began to study it, and try hard now to play my part to dismantle it. One thing I learned from growing up in a really terrible cult and then spending my life studying and trying to understand it is that systems work in mysterious ways. It is possible to grow up surrounded by systemic injustices and never see it, like fish who don't know water. Just trust me. If you saw how dedicated some of the survivors that grew up in a cult, most infamous for abusing children, are to denying that they ever suffered any abuse, you'd understand. We code our experiences to be able to understand them. You have to go back and code privilege. I've learned that people can be very dedicated to the narrative of denying privilege, as it's too hard to accept. They believe if they accept that there are things in life they have that they didn't deserve, then they can never be proud of any of their achievements again. When my husband was struggling to understand his male privilege because he sincerely felt he'd worked for everything he has, I explained it in this way. Babe, in 1990, at 8 years old, you watched Top Gun and you decided to be a pilot. And everyone in your life fell in line to help you make that a reality. He just retired as a special operations helicopter pilot. My question to him was simple. Do you think an 8-year-old girl in 1990 would have had that same story to tell? He has a sister, so he got it immediately. But for everybody that tries to say, yes, it absolutely would have been the same in my family, they would have encouraged the women. Women couldn't be military pilots in 1990. It's doors that were held open for you that were slammed shut for others. It doesn't mean you didn't work hard to get to that door. It means it was open when you did. Once we accept the existence of privilege in our lives, we begin to see where the cracks in the system are, the ones we can pry our privileged fingers into and begin to pull it down. We are embarrassed about privilege because if one group is advantaged, then we have to admit that another is disadvantaged. When we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunity to make real change. Ijoma Oluo, so you want to talk about race. This is one of the concepts I've decided to dedicate my life to. As a society, we can get there. To tie it back to Minesweeper and why I think there is so much resistance to the existence of the trick, I think it's because once you see it, the game is over. T-shirts can be gotten in my link. People tell me, well, that trick defeats the purpose of the game, which is kind of true. At least it changes it. Once you see your privilege, it changes the game. If you are a good person, you can't sit by and accept that your undeserved advantage is because of an institutionalized system that disadvantages others. You are then forced to do the work, to understand your blind spots, and change. Being privileged doesn't mean that you are always wrong, and people without privilege are always right. It means that there is a good chance you are missing a few very important pieces of the puzzle. Ijoma Oluo, so you want to talk about race. What accepting the existence of privilege, or the trick, does mean is that we can see the game in a new way. Once we see it, we can come for it. Minesweeper, expert level, 99 seconds. White people have to tear down white privilege. Men have to tear down male privilege, and on and on. We can do it once we see it. Thanks for reading along, and I look forward to the discussion. The shirt says, just a neurodivergent atheist born to religious extremists, because I say that a lot. So someone told me to put it on a t-shirt. So I did. You can get them in my t-shirt shop, disrespectful t-shirts. I think someone bought one while I was just reading, because someone bought something from Etsy. Okay. Ooh, we still have so much time today. We go fast. It's actually my daughter's fault. She got out to school very quickly because she was very excited about a field trip. Ooh, maybe we can do the next chapter of Write Your Story right now. I think that's what I will do. Get all of those books. This is what I said I was going to do. And everybody laughed at me. Everybody laughed at me. You said gas stations are a constant source of my husband and I discussing privilege. Say more about that. I don't pump gas at all. Gas stations are the #1 places where women get abducted and assaulted, followed by parking garages. Maybe it's parking garages followed by gas stations. But anyway, my husband pumps the gas. We share a car, so it's not as crazy as it sounds. Oh, yay, Gregory got his hat. Good morning, South Carolina. Okay. Yeah, the series is just going to be me talking about how I got a book. Hello, everybody. Every time. Hello, everybody. If you're watching this series on how to write your own story, you're probably thinking about taking whatever interesting life you lived and turning it into a story, like maybe one of these. I decided to do that in 2018. I listened to Educated. My first thought was, why didn't I write that book? And then my second thought, because I'm well trained in entrepreneurship, was when somebody does it first, that doesn't mean you can't do it. That is proof of concept. I identified what I really liked about Educated, which is that there's one idea to this book. And the idea, the way I describe it, is that education is our best defense against extremism. So I said to myself, on this day in fall of 2018, I'm going to do the next book, like Educated. And everybody laughed at me. In 2022, fall, September 20th to be exact, the day that Don't Ask, Don't Tell came down 11 years earlier, I published Uncultured. There's a big fancy hardback copy of it as well. And I say regularly that the reason that I have a major Macmillan book out in the world is not because I had an incredible story, and it's not because I'm a really good writer. It's because I'm a good military planning officer, and I put together a plan and I pursued it, and I didn't listen to all the haters. And this is one of the biggest things that I learned out of entrepreneurship, is that if someone's telling you that it can't be done, or you're wrong, or they're giving you their negative advice on something, and they haven't built a really successful business, or they haven't published a really big traditional publishing big five book, then they're not the person for you to be listening to. They are most likely the crabs trying to keep you down. So one of the reasons I was laughed at was because Educated sold 4 million copies in its first year. Educated stayed in hard copy alone for 4 years because it was that popular. Ultimately, Educated went viral. What I learned through the process, where I did sell my book as the next Educated, and I did have a major book come out, which has done very well, but did not go viral, is that it is impossible to predict when something goes viral. Nobody knows how to do it. That's why Warren Buffett retired after he hit it big. If anyone knew how to do it, any of these PR people, any of these whatever, they would have done it for themselves, and they would be on a boat right now. So that's like one of my big lessons. But that doesn't mean that you can't compare yourself to those big things. As I used to tell my partners all the time, Facebook would have been laughed out of the room if they went in and said they were going to have 4 billion users one day. Somebody is going to be the next Facebook. Somebody was going to be the next Educated. Turns out it was How My Mom Died was the next big book that went viral, which came out 2 weeks before Uncultured. And this, the reason I'm talking about this is because the reason that I got a book deal was because I had been coaching entrepreneurship for the past 3 years. And I had been looking for the comparison, right? I was saying, I'm going to be the next Brene Brown. And everyone was saying, that's a lifestyle business. That's not something you can grow, something you can scale. And I was like, of course it is. Brene Brown, Oprah. So I started asking myself, like, who invests in those people? And the only answer I came up with was book publishers. So this was part of why I decided to go after a big traditional book deal. Now, the first chapter of this, I talked about the 3 different ways to get a book out in the world. You can self-publish it, you can hybrid publish it, or you can go with a traditional publisher. That is one of the first decisions you need to make, because then the process that you build is going to be completely different. And another thing is, don't ever even say or think the words, oh, my book is like nothing else out there. Because that is the knell of death to an investor? One, tells them you haven't done your research. Two, if there's nothing else out there like it, why would they bet on you? Yes, blue ocean strategy sometimes happens, sometimes works, and those people get very rich, but it's not often. So here I was writing a book that really, truly, there is no comparison to, right? Growing up in the Children of God sex cult and going into the US military. Au contraire, mon ami. There was another woman who grew up in the Children of God, who went into the military, who got a 6-figure book deal. And I found her and I contacted her and I asked her what to do. And then I did every single thing she said. So there is always something you can compare your book to. And one of the biggest, I think, pet peeves of any author in the world is when people are like, oh, I want to write a book too. And then somewhere in the conversation, this happens to me with so many men, they'll be like, oh, I mean, I don't really read books. If you are going to start a business that you want investment in, or you are going to try to sell a book to a publisher, traditional or hybrid, you need to be a reader. It's not that you need to be a perfect writer. It's not that you can't get help with writing. I did. There will be a whole thing on that. But you need to know the market. You need to know what you don't want to write. I said this, like I was always going to write a book. It took me 15 years to figure out the kind of book I didn't want to write. And then once I figured that out, I could figure out the kind of book I did want to write. And I hadn't read that many memoirs outside of cult stories when I decided to write one. So I had to go educate myself really, really fast. But I also knew in that moment, I was like, I want to write a book about cults. And it's 2018. So I'm watching a cult leader run America right now. And it will take me 10 years to learn to write a good memoir. And I want to do it in 2. And so I set out to put together my plan to do so. I did it in 4. So kind of got halfway in between. And a lot of people told me, oh, you got so lucky with your timing. And I just look at them and be like, I didn't get lucky with my timing. I was seeing something that I was pretty sure nobody else was seeing. And I decided I had something to say about it. And in fact, the thing I said to the woman who was a former executive of Penguin Random House, who became my co-writer, was I knew that he was going to win in 2016. Not in spite of his extremism, as all the pundits kept saying, but because of it. Okay. So I was like, I'm gonna write a book. First step. Now, I majored in literature and I went into being an Army intelligence officer, which is probably an exact parallel of someone that gets an English degree, literature degree, and then goes into like technical writing as their day job, right? So I have been writing a lot of words my whole life. But you don't have to. And I think part of what's cool about my story is that I got help, and I say I get other authors trying to destroy me over this fact. And I just say, like, I did not promise Macmillan Publishers that I would dredge up all my trauma by myself and pour it into a book. I promised my publishers that if they bet on me, if they invested in Uncultured, that I could produce, however I produced in the back end, something that many thousands of people would agree to pay $28.99 for. And I did. So the good news is, like, there's 2 different ways to write a really good memoir. One of them, which is far more popular, is that you spend 10 years getting good at writing memoir. You read everything you can. You figure out what all of your comps are. You figure out the exact model for your book. You figure out the biggest thing that you can shoot for the stars with. You probably get an MFA. You definitely spend a lot of times in writers groups, and you produce a great book yourself. A book that I am going to read aloud into a video book soon, The Secret Practice. Exact example. Okay, she done that by herself. Obviously, nobody does a book by themselves. That's the other thing. The reason that traditional books are so good is because so many people work on them. So Educated was chosen as Penguin Random House's cornerstone launch. And the way that was explained to me is that means that all 4,000 employees worked on this book for free as part of their job. That's why it's such a good book. That's how you get a book that is blurbed both by Bill Gates and a sitting president, right? Everybody's working on this. For Uncultured, Uncultured gets credited. The number one thing people say is like, there are no typos. There are two. And there was almost a really funny one. I guess I'll just say what that is. So there's one that's like the worst vet bro typo, because where I'm holding a grenade and it's supposed to say spoon, it says spool. And my audio director very nicely let me change that one word. And then in the chapter on medical neglect, according to the will of God, I am having my stepfather speaking Portuguese, but I have him say no in English and then no, which is Spanish, and not no, which is Portuguese. Those are the two that I found. But the reason it doesn't have many typos is because probably 75 to 100 different people worked on it. So the whole benefit of going traditional publishing is that you get all of these experts doing their expert thing on the book. Trust me, the cover that I wanted for Uncultured was not going to sell 50,000 copies of Uncultured. And it was still produced by a professional, but it was just what I wanted, and not what was actually going to sell. So traditional publishing does end up getting about 85% of the profits. However, 15% that I then give 15% to my agent and 25% to my co-writer of 50,000 books is still more than I would have gotten by self-publishing or likely by hybrid publishing. And if you know why you are writing a book and you know what you are writing a book about, you absolutely can go through the process without having the publishing industry tell you what they want you to write. At least I did. If you have that one idea of what your book is about and you have a strong outline and proposal and you're like a full human adult that knows why you're telling the story that you're telling, you're gonna get to write your story. Now, once you deliver that text to your publisher, they get to choose everything else. So I got a right to audition for the audiobook, and I got a right to be consulted on the cover. My agent said to me, you can throw one hissy fit in this process, save it for the cover. And I did, and I did. Okay, so now I'm just going to tell you like a little bit about the plan that I started creating. And then next time we'll talk about like the actual writing of the story. So first things I did was I found the right writers group to be in. If you are a woman writing a memoir, first of all, if you are a woman at all or non-binary, there's a group called The Binders on Facebook. Yes, it is a reference to Mitt Romney's Binders Full of Women. And The Binders, huge, 45,000 when I joined it 4 years ago, so probably much bigger now, of women in publishing, editing, writing at every stage. Then we have sub-binders. There's a sub-binder called Binders Full of Memoirists that every single advantage that I gained, that led to Uncultured being published came out of that group. So when I say like you need to find the right networking group, you need to find the right networking group. That's where I got the blurbs, which is another thing you're going to have to do. You and your author connections are going to have to get blurbs. And even if you get a giant book deal, your book might not be published if you don't have basically a New York Times bestselling author say that they liked your book. This was quite challenging for me, actually, because I went through the process so fast. But I'll tell you, hopefully, in another lesson on how I did that. Okay, so I joined this group. If you are a woman or a non-binary person hearing this, you can find me on Facebook, Daniella Mestenek Young, because it is a secret group, and I can invite you to it. I pretty much do nothing else on Facebook. So don't worry, you won't start hearing all of my political opinions all of a sudden. And you can unfriend me after you join the group. But it's a very good group. Okay, so in that group, I heard about this book called The Byline Bible by Sue Shapiro, who is in the group and who's very like responsive and gives all kinds of information. The Byline Bible is the absolute best thing for you to read if you want to get serious about publishing a book. It is the most tactical advice that I've ever seen in my life, probably on any topic. So I bought that book. And the book is literally about, it's like, so you want to write a memoir? Okay, this is how you're going to write a splashy essay and get it in with, get it into a magazine that editors and agents read, and that also shows that you have range. And I will be recording that essay that I wrote soon, and it will be part of this series. And when I mean it's tactical, it's like you're going to walk away from reading that book with like 20 ideas of different essays that you could write. And there's over 100 sample essays in the book with many, many more linked. One of the pieces of advice that she gives, which goes hand in hand with if you want to write a book, you should be a reader, is that if you intend to make money from writing, you should probably invest some money in your writing. So I went to the Hugo House in Seattle. I was living in Seattle at the time. And there are adult writing classes everywhere. You can also find them online. And I took this class for $250, and it was called Show and Tell. And that is where I workshopped the chapter that is called Jesus Freaks, which is about the murder-suicide in Children of God, and the moment that I realized it was a cult. And that ended up becoming the sample chapter in my book. And I can tell you that I made many, many, many zeros of return on investment from that $250 I spent. It was like exactly a round number of zeros. It was very nice. Okay, so I did that. Okay. I also, like, while I was networking and while I was figuring out how I was going to write a big essay, I decided that I was going to hire a consultant who could help me figure out the story that I was going to tell. Because remember, I didn't know how to write a book. Read a lot of books. Didn't know how to write them. Okay, so, and also I know very, very well that there's a million ways you can tell a story, right? So the book I was originally writing was called Beautifully Broken, and it was going to be a very different book. It was a very horrible book proposal, but better than the one I wrote when I was 24 for a book called The Girl from Nowhere, which line I did put in Uncultured, and I'm very proud of. With that, wait till you're ready to write a book. It should be at least a decade after what you're talking about. I had almost 20 years from my cult experience, and I had only 7 years from my military experience. And when I tell you the bias and the vitriol that I had when I was writing about the end of my career, that I had to just like send off to co-writers that I very fortunately had and be like, please make this not angry and nasty. Yeah, 7 years wasn't long enough. So I hired this consultant named Brandy Larson, and she styled herself at the time a woman's finishing coach. So she is exactly what I needed, which is I want to write a book. Help me do it for some money. I paid her, I think it was like an $800 package, and it was 4 meetings. And I paid her, so $800, so 4 meetings. And my goal was to walk out of this with an outline for the book that I was going to write. She calls me her most prepared client ever. And one of the reasons I was so prepared, and this is some of the best advice I've received, unfortunately, from a crazy cult leader chick that I gave a lot of money to. But it was just sit down, take a Word document. She made it in Excel, which was much harder. And write down every year of your life, a number for every year of your life, and then start writing down the basics, where you were, what happened, blah, blah, blah. My addition to this is once you've gone over it about 10 times, and you probably have a 20 or 30 page document, you are now ready to start thinking about what stories you're going to pull out to craft the book with the idea that you're trying to show people that your story makes you an expert in. Something I learned, very, very important, is 1, we all have to learn to tell our own stories. And 2, we are not the people that necessarily know the best stories to illustrate the thing that we're trying to illustrate. And that will come back again and again in the process of writing the book. But for example, there's this very touching story in chapter 2, A Tale of Two Mommies, of a memory when I was 3 years old, which is about as far back as my memories go. And I was using a very different memory, right? Like I was going to use a very different memory. And thanks to me having this whole document and having an advisor, it was like, no, this one's not strong enough. Let's pick another one. When I did Un-American, which you can get as a video of me reading aloud, my second memoir on Patreon or TikTok as a subscriber, I put the whole concept together and then went to a different co-writer who was the third writer on Un-American or on Uncultured. And she was writing Un-American with me. And she was like, this is all gold, but you don't have a climax. Like you literally, where's the point at the end of the book? Not the point, but the climax. And I was like, oh, let me tell you this thing I call Salt of the Earth, this story. And she was like, perfection, right? And that's now the climax of the book. And it's very good. So we don't always know the stories that we need to tell to make the points that we're trying to make either. I've completely forgotten about YouTube, but we're all still here. So I started meeting with her. I had 4 meetings, right? And it was literally, she was educating me on the publishing process while we are also figuring out what is the outline of this book going to be. This is very, very important because when you have to write a book proposal to sell your book, which we will do a whole nother episode on, you need to know what the book is about. You need to know the whole book before you sell it. A lot of people, because you sell memoir or research book on proposal, they kind of make the same mistake that students make when they're writing a paper, which is their thesis is like, I'm going to examine X, Y, and Z. And then they stop there. I am going to examine X, Y, and Z to show that having to prove your masculinity and gun ownership in America are correlated. That's a full thesis. Like you already know what the research is, right? In the way I explain this to people for papers is you say what you're going to say, then you say it, then you say what you said. And that's introduction, paper, conclusion. I also have a good class on writing papers and getting an A no matter what. And it's called Taming Medusa. And I should probably remake that and put it on one of my channels. So we're working on the outline. And in the meantime, I'm networking and I am thinking about what essay I'm going to write. So my big break comes when editor, her name was Lily Dansinger, and she is an editor at Narratively at the time. She also has a memoir. I'm not going to pull up the name of it in my head, but she also edited a book called Burn It Down, Women Writing About Anger, which is phenomenal. Okay, so she posted what's called a call for pitches inside the memoirist group. And her call for pitches was, I'm looking for a brand new story that I've never heard before, or I'm looking for a twist on a story I've heard 1,000 times that makes it feel brand new. So my pitch had two very important things. It had, her name is spelled with 2 L's, and I did not misspell it. So commonly misspelled first name, did not misspell it. Very important, especially for someone that gets called Danielle a lot. And then the rest of my pitch was, how about Americans cheering on the anniversary of 9/11? And how about a soldier at a memorial for soldiers she's just lost, questioning everything? Something like that. I did not have a single byline, right? Like I'd never published anything. Actually, I published 2 articles in a military magazine, but I didn't have anything that I could give her to be like, I can write. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that just because you've lived through something interesting doesn't mean you know how to write, and especially doesn't mean you know how to write a book. So if you need help, get help. And so she told me she accepted the pitch in under 24 hours, but she accepted it on spec, which means I'm going to do all the work of writing it. And if it's well written, then she will give me $300 or whatever it was. So I set to writing. I did not have a lawyer look at the contract because I was only going to get $300, and I had already invested so much money in trying to do my own thing. And I was just like, this is crazy. I did have my lawyer friend who works for the IRS look at it, which was not actually helpful. Needs to be an entertainment lawyer to look at entertainment contracts. And by the way, no matter what you are writing about or how serious your topic, child rape and cults, you are in the entertainment industry. And the more you understand that, the better you will fare. So I was like, I'm just going to do it. So I did it. I wrote the essay, and it got published. And 4 days later, an agent, the very juniorest agent from a very large New York agency, called me and wanted to sign me on the spot. I didn't sign on the spot. I went and talked to my co-writer, and we decided that I was going to sign. Absolutely not sure if this man would be able to sell my book. It was his first memoir. He was coming mostly from children's books. But my reasoning was that the lieutenant, who's the general's aide, has more power than a lot of like lieutenant colonels or majors, right? So like getting somebody at the big agency is a big deal. So I signed it, and I never heard from another agent, right? So this was just like, it just happened. It never, every time we were like on a call about writing the book, my co-writer would be like, it just never happens this way. So our 4th meeting was supposed to be, the outline is done, and we're now going to talk about kind of the book proposal, but I can educate myself on that. But we're going to talk about querying agents, like writing a query letter, and her brainstorming like how she can help me find an agent. Meanwhile, I come back to the table and I've already got an agent. So that was when she also decided that she was going to help me write it for free. And by free, I mean a percentage of the book. The reason I say for free is because that can turn into a percentage of nothing, as it did for the person that helped me write Un-American. Although now that I've found a alternative way to sell it, she is getting some money. And I say this because, like, yes, it happens, but it almost never happens. And it's probably not going to happen for you. In fact, anyone telling you their process and telling you it's going to happen for you is trying to con you. Keep that in mind. The one thing I did have going for me is I had a very big story, right? And everyone could kind of see that. So she took this bet. It paid off for her, but We didn't know that for about 2 years of working. Mostly, though, you are going to pay people to help you write your book up front. These are many, many, many people in this realm, in the author services. I have a friend, Bethany Kelly, who runs a company called Publishing Partner, which is a great place to start if you want to like go get your book. I would advise you that if you are going to self-publish, the 4 things you spend your money on is a legal review, the cover, so was getting back to the writing. So she decided to write it with me. So we are now going to start, we're at the part where we're going to start like building the book proposal. And that will be the whole next thing. So now it is 2019. Yeah, it's actually 2018. All of this happened in about 2 months. And I'm like, okay, I'm probably going to write a book. Totally not sure that I'm going to blow up my life yet. That certainty comes in 2020, summer of 2020, when a low-ranking Mexican-American soldier went missing and they didn't look for her for 60 days. And when her family finally got Congress to demand that the Army looks for her, they found her body in 3 shallow graves very quickly. And one of my first thoughts was they would have looked for me. The system would have assessed me as more important. And I did not have family that was going to Congress to demand my return. But the straight presenting white captain comes across the table is missing. The system sees me as more valuable. And I was like, why does nobody care? Why does nobody care that, I had to call the nonprofit and just quit on the spot from their board. And I literally said to them, you all can't stop raping and murdering us. Like, still to this day, I see I know 0 names of good male veterans out there publicly getting angry about the things that happen to almost 100% of their women colleagues. So that was when I was like, somebody is just going to have to bleed their soul onto the page and really talk about what it is like for us when we, the Daughters of America, disappear behind the high commune walls of the Department of Defense. And then about a second later, I was like, oh crap, that's me, isn't it? I'm the one with the big story and the ability to write it and the spouse that's going to support me and keep childcare and a little bit of money to invest. And so I did. Basically kind of assessed that I was the perfect victim, that both the cult and the military would have a very, very hard time shutting up. And so I was going to do this thing. And this is how it began. And then the last thing I will say is the contract, on the one hand, I would absolutely do it again. I have a book today because I signed that narratively contract and I didn't push back. There was another thing that was going to publish and I used the prologue and I pitched it and then I sold the book. And then I was like, they were like, we won't publish this because it's not original. And we tried to negotiate and ask for things and we just lost it. So when I say like, I would do it again, I would still do it again. But I also accidentally signed away the movie rights of my life to Warner Brothers with a cap on it. And the cap was very, very high at the time, which is why I was like, if Warner Brothers wants to make a movie out of my life for this much money, I'll do it. Then I sold the book for that much money. And all of a sudden, the film contract was very, very problematic. And what happened was they narratively has a pretty good writer's contract. It really, really tells you that like you have the right to write your book, your story. However, then they chirpily tell you that they have this wonderful partnership with Warner Brothers that helps make content, film content based on stories that they publish. And because of the way contracts turn out, it has to do with Nixon, Republican president, still screwing me over. The highline story of my life, which is left cult, joined army, which is what went on the contract, Warner Brothers has first dibs on. So this is the lesson of why you always have a lawyer look at everything. And when I got the big contract for the book, even though my agent was like, I do this every day, you don't need a lawyer, I still paid a lot of money to have a lawyer look at it. So yeah, that's going to be this section of Write Your Story, which is I went idea to agent and writing partner, right? Idea that was nothing. It could have been nothing. I could have just been like, why didn't I write that book first? Poof. And it got to where like we're making it happen. If I back out of this, some people are going to be disappointed. And it was 100% process. And other than getting the agent, it's 100% of like anyone can do this. This part, right? Not anyone. The people that have the same privileges that I mentioned could also do this. And we will pick up next time with the process of writing the book proposal, which is your marketing document for your book. And the disappointing thing here is that I can't really talk about querying agents because I never had to. I have helped a couple other people unsuccessfully query my agent. So I don't have a lot of good advice there. But there's a woman called Jane Friedman. And if you Google Jane Friedman, any writing term whatsoever, her information is gold. So put together a query letter and go out and start and be prepared for a lot of rejection. Uncultured got rejection 19 times before it sold in a giant deal. And we'll talk about that later. I should not have done that. I should have recorded the book. Hello, David. Ooh, I remind you of a math teacher that shocked you out of cult-induced misogyny. I love that. I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. I'm going to plug my microphone in. I should probably have good sound for something I hope people pay me for. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop streaming on YouTube because I need to use this computer camera for my recording. So bye to folks on YouTube. Come join me on TikTok where I also stream for free and more often because it's a little bit easier.